Hello everyone, today we talk about Frederick II as a man of science. Usually I talk about abstract topics of usually of social themes and very broad pictures, and I quite rarely venture into the story of single characters, but Frederick II really makes at least one of the most important figures in medieval history, not just for um, politically speaking, but also as a great figure of human being, and especially for his intellectual um, side and the great accomplishments that he obtained in his court of Palermo, that at the first half of the 13th century was definitely the most advanced in Europe from a cultural point of view, and not only telling the truth, also for the organization of the state. But today what we're discussing is essentially the scientific and cultural aspects of the court of Frederick II, and really looking widely into this extremely rich environment in terms of knowledge of knowledges at plural, and that were also deriving from the privileged position of Sicily at that time between East and West, and having a very multicultural background as a kingdom. So, generally speaking, when introducing the figure of Frederick II, Frederick of Hohenstaufen, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily, and many other titles that here we want to be recalling, simply the greatest man of Europe at that time, it's very difficult to express judgments about his persona, essentially because of the lack of knowledge that we have about him, the lack of objective knowledge that we have about him. Frederick is a figure in which, historically speaking, has been written a lot during his times, but that remains enigmatic in many ways because it's very difficult to express an objective judgment on the basis of those sources. Even today, historiographically, we lack a comprehensive study on the figure of Frederick II, aside from the works of Kantorowicz and Abulafia, that have each one their own perception of Frederick, and that have to be read through that, because at this point it's not the debate is not much about the concrete historical figure, but the interpretation that is being given about him. And there is sometimes a very negative prejudice towards Frederick that also comes from the sources that were written about him. Let's say that Frederick suffered of bad press, largely, if anything, because the Pope put in motion a whole systematic propagandistic machine against him, and the media of those times were in part the Pope and his capacity of putting at the corner certain sovereigns, just because they didn't follow St. Peter's soils policies. And in this sense, we have also to remember that in the struggle between Frederick and the Pope, and the papacy in general, as long as it was adverse to him, the papacy was at the peak of its temporal power. So having the Pope against you, living in that time, wasn't gonna make a great, a great help for you. And we have sometimes the perception that Frederick, being definitely a cultured man, a very open-minded person, but at the same time also all the negative side effects of these qualities that can be, the unscrupulousness of his mind, the fact that he could achieve also very crude things, there is I can't say a dark legend over him, but definitely even his failure in his last years in the ferocious fights against the Lombard League definitely left the impression that when he died in 1250 he had basically failed. And obviously everyone who fails in history is subject to a more severe judgment by those who follow. And telling the truth, there are a lot of stupid ideas that were built up about him, like the fact that he was not a religious man, that he was even an atheist. And this is something I've been hearing many people actually believing today still, while we know at least pretty well, historically speaking, that Frederick might have been someone who pushed himself far intellectually, even at the boundaries of orthodoxy, but there are no reasons to believe that he was actually an atheist. On the contrary, it was part of the Christian mind of those times to be extremely anxious to investigate the world, the universe. And Frederick witnesses, if anything, his great knowledge. The great his great intellectual skills and ability of looking beyond the usual, narrow perspective that could exist in the average person of that times. Kings of feudal Europe, especially at that time, were usually not extremely cultured. Let me tell you, Frederick was extraordinary. He spoke like 7 languages. He had a huge library, and especially he was constantly in touch. We will be seeing this today with the most advanced cultures of those times, intellectually speaking. But the accuse of heresy and atheism that went basically at the same pace in this sense all came from the wealth propaganda of his times. So, as we were saying, the machine which the Pope put in motion, and that was, however, a bit more rooted really in the wealth bloc of Europe of those times. When we talk about wealths, and we use this term that derives from the Italian factions in the communal world, that however reflected a broader international factionalism between those who were pro-Pope and pro-Emperor. So the wealths obviously at that time were against Frederick. Although it's a bit more complicated, but we don't have enough time to explain this, but just to give you a brilliant example, Dante Alighieri, who was a white Guelph, which means a guy who wasn't, who was obviously, who had a pretty balanced view of what the emperor had to be in charge of and what the Pope had. He was kind of favorable to the empire from a political point of view. He wasn't a black Guelph that instead was theoretically all about papacy and his allies. But he puts, although admiring the figure and the Hohenstaufen dynasty as a whole, he puts Frederick in hell in his comedy. And Frederick is in hell with the accusation of Epicureanism, which was one of those old those ancient philosophies present in the ancient world that had been so famous at the point of epitomizing in the mental, in the medieval point perspective, the prototype of the pagan philosopher that knows quite a lot, that is probably quite wise, but is still heretic because he it comes like Epicurus to deny essentially the existence of a deity, and in giving a very materialistic picture of the universe. In fact, Dante writes like Epicurus, who puts the world randomly by pointing out that according to the Epicurean philosophy and physics, the world was essentially a random combination of matter with no greater project like the theological one of Christianity. But at that point, the accuse of Epicureanism was pretty much standard. It was like the accuse of sodomy. It's not that all the people that even Dante puts in hell for sodomy were actually sexually promiscuous people. They were just rumors that, however, were meant to address a general lifestyle that had been perceived as not good under certain points of view, that maybe was still a rumor, and that brought to the ruin of many figures. But besides this, we have no reason, once again, to believe that Frederick was an atheist. There is no historical evidence for that. And what we can instead see, also through his interests and to the relations that he had with the great wise people and cultural people of the time, he had a very sincere, very honest scientific curiosity. And this is not a few for a man of the Middle Ages. Not even in the 13th century, when there was objectively, even thanks to courts like the one of Palermo, the spread of knowledge, especially from the East, from this new world that the Europeans had begun to know directly, at least since a very few centuries. And that was making a flow, lots of manuscripts, a lot of technologies from east to west, and that had to bring the Westerners to cope with all this new amount of information that especially the religious authorities obviously always saw as a potential source of doctrinal confusion, of unorthodox thinking, etc. And we can say that the court of Frederick in Sicily was really the irradiation center of very great novelties and cultural experimentations. First of all, when we think about the science in the ancient as well as in the medieval world, we don't have to think it's science from our modern perspective that stresses essentially technology as the greatest part of it. The ancient and medieval world had a very low technological potential. In many ways, technological advancement was quite slow. You can argue that there were no major changes at this time compared to in medieval world, aside maybe for optics, compared to what had already been discovered in the ancient world, without obviously wanting to diminish medieval civilization, which was capable of achieving practically much greater things than the ancient world in many ways, but thanks to the same knowledge that it had acquired to the ancient world. So it's interesting to consider this. But when we talk about science in medieval terms, scientia in Latin, we're talking essentially about knowledge, about comprehension. That is something that goes beyond. It's mostly a cognitive process rather than a technical one. And most of what we call ancient and medieval science was actually made up of literary work and philological works. So not really something that had to do with science in the modern sense of the word. And in fact, what probably the Sicilian court of Frederick II is remembered for is its literary tradition, and especially its poetic school. Also here, what does school mean in medieval terms? It doesn't mean, guys that kids that go sitting on benches and listening to a master, to a teacher speaking. We're talking about essentially an intellectual circle that of intellectuals who were in relation the one with the other. And that usually formed itself autonomously, spontaneously around the major, the most advanced communities of those times. So it was obvious that in a city like Palermo, in which there was a court that incidentally also paid and was interested in getting prestige, etc., a lot of intellectuals from all over the world, literally, would go there and start to interact with each other. And in literary terms, the Sicilian poetry actually stemmed from the French poetic tradition. That was definitely the most advanced of the time, because the French at that time, France was the greatest power of Europe, even greater than the Kingdom of Sicily of Frederick. It was extremely developed, it was extremely rich. The French had managed to take away Normandy and to the English dynasty. They had managed to expand in the south of France. There was a substantial dynastic continuity in the Capetian house, so the power of France would be measured also in the great cultural influences that it started having by producing chivalric models, because 13th century France is the triumph of the feudal and chivalric system. And obviously the most fashionable literary tradition, not just in this century but even afterwards, also in the 14th century, would remain gravitating around the chivalric cycles, like the Song of Roland, and all the great chivalric epics, and this would have a great influence on Sicily, and would be the base of Sicilian poetry. But Sicilian poetry in this sense was exposed also to other cultural influences, mostly the Greek and Arab one, and the syncretism between these traditions was expressed in the Aulic, in an extremely pure language that the Sicilian of the time could express, and that would in turn had a huge influence on the development of Italian poetry, especially on Dante, that we remained here, but also in the circles that existed in Tuscany before him. And there was also a lot of contact with Provence. So you see here in the Tyrrhenian Sea a great exchange of knowledges and literary tradition between France, Sicily, and Italy. Italy in here and didn't have a kingdom proper, at least from a practical point of view. But the Italian middle classes were so advanced that they could read extremely high poetry at that time and produce men of the caliber of Dante, who basically was the greater writer of all Western Middle Ages, and that tells you how knowledge was being transmitted from really at all the levels of society. It was not something just elitistic, but also flowing into the middle classes that incidentally could travel, could study abroad, could do a lot of things, and this is really a moment of great rise of Europe. Also thanks to these dynamics. The Sicilian poetry, together with the Song of the Creatures of Saint Francis of Assisi, are substantially the basis of the Italian vernacular poetry, because Sicilian poetry, Sicilian being still linguistically Italian, even though differentiated obviously from the Tuscan one, but still expressed in vernacular. This is also a very important choice. Poetry is not just in Latin. It can be heard by anyone, and there was a great aesthetical effect of these verses. This poetry were extremely sophisticated, extremely refined. They sounded extremely angelic in many ways. There was a lot of chivalric ideas being expressed there: the courtly love, the angel-like woman, this sort of platonic love that was expressed by extremely refined tones, telling the truth, jarring quite hard with a society that in many ways was also quite quite the contrary, in the sense that we know that these poets had a very intense sexual life. They went with prostitutes. They kind of lived the dualism of bad and evil in a certain sense. Also in this sense, Dante himself seemingly had a mistress somewhere else, and telling the truth, if we have Dante's comedy, we owe it to his wife that, albeit being betrayed, pushed him for writing and eventually sharing his comedy, because Dante wasn't even very favorable at completing or spreading his work. So we have to thank this woman for it. And we have to I made this premise because among the poets of the so-called Sicilian school, we have the same Frederick II and his sons Heinz and Manfred. Heinz would be captured by the Guelphs in northern Italy, and he would spend the rest of his life imprisoned in a tower, composing poetry and interacting, telling the truth. He had many visitors that were interested also about he played the lute. He was the embodiment of these man of poetry of that time on the Provençal model. So was the son Manfred, and Dante recalls in the comedy and not just in there but also in other works, the greatness of the Hohenstaufen in Sicily as great man of letters, and especially prized for that poetry that he had been he had grown up with, essentially, as a young Tuscan man. And however, aside from the literary inclinations of, you have to think that the literary tradition of the Sicilian school after the fall of the Hohenstaufen in Sicily, after the conquest, the Angevin conquest, lived on in other areas of Europe. Incidentally, I translated a work for my master degree that was written in the first half of the 14th century by an Austrian minstrel and poet, whose master had studied at the court of Manfred in Sicily, and that is quite fascinating. So we're saying that these models lived on in this great picture of this great landscape of European literature, of chivalric chivalric literature of that time. But aside from, as I was saying, from the poetic interests, Frederick had also scientific and philosophical interests, and also in here he followed essentially traditions that came from other worlds. First of all, he was the only heir of the Norman kingdom of Sicily. After all, his mother was Constance of Hauteville, who was the last heiress of the Hauteville dynasty that from Normandy had founded the kingdom of Sicily. And despite his father, Frederick's father, being a German, it's probable that Frederick also strongly felt, definitely as a part of his identity, the Norman legacy, for sure. And among the characteristics of the Norman cultural environment in Sicily, there was the presence of the greatest scientists of the world at the time, also coming from the Muslim world. And the Muslim world at this time being extremely advanced. Baghdad, before the destruction operated by the Mongols, was seemingly the greatest city for knowledge, culture, technology and medicine, etc. He was, and the Muslim world, generally speaking, tried to imitate that model, and all the various emirates and caliphates that existed tended to imitate also this mecenatism that was showed at the courts of the Abbasid court of Baghdad. And around the libraries of these capitals gravitated also a lot of great scholars and very highly learned men. And Sicily at that time wasn't really a very Muslim-friendly country, but for Western standards, definitely it was the most tolerant you could find, and that world was very much more open-minded than ours in many ways, because at the court of Palermo it didn't matter what kind of religion you were, but you were esteemed as an individual, and therefore all the great scholars from all over the world were accepted, whether they were Muslims or Jews. It didn't matter. as long as they enriched the cultural prestige of the Sicilian court. And there are a lot of men coming literally from all over the world, as we were saying. Here we have some examples. There is a guy who came from the far north of Europe, Michael Scott, who was a mathematician, and especially, and he's mostly famous, and he was the science advisor and court astrologer of Frederick II. Astrology was really a thing at that time. The fact that these guys were Christians didn't mean that they didn't believe in astrology. On the contrary, at that time there was basically no distinction between astronomy and astrology. The stars had been studied since the beginning of human civilization, if anything, because it's the first thing you see when you look up at night in the sky. And there was a lot of symbolism in the medieval world that was related to the position of the stars at the moment of birth. I mean, astrology, all the things with the zodiac, the horoscopes, etc. Also, Frederick had been, he was born, if I'm not wrong, on December the 26th, and this had been conceived from the astrologers of court as an omen, because the 25th December was the birth of Christ, and the fact that Frederick was born the day after meant that he had to basically carry out Jesus' legacy and all this stuff. I mean, these people really believed it. They were quite keen on astrology, and a very well-learned man coming from Scotland at this time, like Michael or Michael, as you want to call him, or Michael in Latin, was an extremely important addition. However, Michael Scott is important not just for the role that he had at court, but also for, broadly speaking, philosophical terms, because he was an Averroist, or better, he is mostly famous for having translated Averroes into the West. You know that Averroes is this extremely important commentator who came from Al-Andalus in southern Spain, so he was a Muslim as well, mostly famous as the commentator of Aristotle. And Aristotle at that time was spreading, thanks to figures like Michael, into the West, and it was perceived by the church as a great threat, because basically the Westerners didn't know Aristotle as an ancient authority. They had mostly studied Plato, because St. Augustine had translated him, and therefore St. Augustine had commented Plato, and and all the Christians had followed Augustine's authority in go look how Plato really was. And Aristotle was coming back from the East at that point, and his philosophy was revolutionary in many ways, and being so complex and precise and technical, and especially backed by scientific reflections, because Aristotle was essentially a naturalist, a natural philosopher. The whole perspective of the medieval world was kind of shaking, because Aristotle's physics was substantially different from the Christian one, and only a man like Saint Thomas Aquinas would manage as a Christian to integrate the Aristotelic system into the Christian doctrine, and this had obviously very famous consequences also in the not just in medieval, but also in the modern age. for the philosophy of science, etc. And Michael Scott wasn't an Averroes himself. On the contrary, he disagreed with Averroes. He, however, translated it and made it public, essentially, for those time standards. And it's interesting because the Aristotelianism that came through into Western Europe wasn't the proper Greek Aristotle, but it was the comment that Averroes had done on him. So obviously there was an interpretation of Aristotle that was filtered by the Muslim critics, and also within the same Muslim world being there various schools, various philosophers, and Westerners were highly influenced at that point by the interpretation that it had been done about Aristotle by Averroes. Another great figure at the court of Frederick II was Theodore of Antioch, who was a philosopher, medic, and translator, coming from Syria, Antioch in Syria, and he was part of the Syrian church, so he wasn't Catholic proper. And he had also studied quite a lot into Mosul at the end of the 12th century, so he also knew pretty well the Muslim world. And you have to think this world, Antioch being in Crusader hands at that time. So think about all the cultural influences that these scholars really had. And think especially here how these men of science, like a medic, like Theodore was, were also most importantly translator, for saying how important the translation of the old works of the ancient world was considered the way to acquire scientific knowledge, scientific competence. He was also an alchemist and one of the greater masters of that time. Then another figure is the Jew Jude ben Salomon Cohen, who incidentally you have to think that southern Italy had pretty substantial Jewish communities at that time. Not aware really whether so much in Sicily, but definitely Naples, if I'm not wrong, really existed there in consistent numbers, and he was mostly an encyclopedist and philosopher, and he obviously all these guys essentially were extremely well were extremely reverent towards Frederick, who was the guy at the top. So at his court they would praise the sovereign and thanking him for the opportunities that he had given to them for staying at court and researching and sharing information with all the other philosophers. Obviously there were a lot of jealousies as well, a lot of infights in many ways, but that's also where progress, scientifically speaking, comes from. Because if we all had the same opinion, yeah, nobody would have the problem of of minding about saying something more. Instead, the sharing of all these experiences had a dramatic impact even in the cultural development of the Western civilization at the time. And all these people lived in Sicily at Frederick's court. However, Frederick was in contact, especially regarding to scientific matters, with scholars coming from the world Mediterranean, and he factually wanted answers. He was extremely curious. He wanted to know their opinions and reflecting on them. And we're also quite there are existing the letters that Frederick wrote in part to these men. Excuse me, I drink a little. Here we go. So, coming to another very fascinating side of Frederick II, we have to talk about falconry. Now, as you know, falconry in the medieval world was a hobby, let's call it this way. It was a very serious thing, as a matter of fact, and status symbol of European, not just of European, but we can say usually about the feudal aristocracies in many ways. If anything, because feudal aristocracies are normally but also, yeah, it's not just about the feudal world. We can see that also in more centralized states. But one of the prerogatives of aristocracy at the time was hunting, and falconry was definitely one of the most prized abilities that a skilled huntman and could have, because falconry requires first of all, it requires a lot of money, because falcons cost really a lot, but falcons have to be trained to catch prey and to return on the, you see that on the glove of the master, and it's all about the hunting expertise that this person has. And it was a great it was a very fashionable thing among aristocracy, and the particular aspect that relatively to Frederick is that he wrote a falconry treaty, known in Latin as De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, which means, translated, about the art of hunting with birds. And normally, he basically it's very fascinating, not extremely just for for falconry itself, but because it contains a lot of knowledge of certain zootechnologies of that time, that reveals also the great ability of observation of Frederick's. And normally such treatises would be very standard in the medieval world, in the sense there were normally the so-called bestiaries. I mean, there were sort of zoological encyclopedias that that the animals, to which animals were listed essentially as symbols of vices and virtues, because the Christians and as well as other civilizations in that time believed that essentially every animal had been created by God with a as the symbol of a particular quality of sort. So I don't know, the fox was cunning, the cat was cunning too, but it was a bit more vicious, and there was a lot of morals actually applied to the strictly scientifical knowledge. And instead, the Frederick work is very different, because it's really modern in the scientific meaning of the term, because all the various branches of this topic, that is training, and talking also about other animals, and about horses and stuff, were analyzed as independent branches. So it's remarkable that Frederick wrote this, because it shows that he was completely ahead from the average treatises that were written at the time by standard, and he was very independently minded because of this. So and by the way, Frederick knew very well the treatises of his time, so you cannot say that he had not known them, so he was reasoning in a different way. He was actively proposing another method, another model. So and he was the Holy Roman Emperor, so the greater, the higher secular authority of the time, and this is really remarkable. And there is also, in modern terms, this idea that there is experience, direct observation, so certain principles that really have to do with empirism and that are very fascinating at this age. So you can imagine that Frederick, at this point, being a sort of legendary figure, even when he was still alive. And this is normal in many ways, because the emperor of Christianity was supposed to be a kind of uncommon figure, but definitely Frederick, even as a human being, stood for his remarkable qualities, and he fueled his the figure of the man of knowledge, that has sort of even too bold attitude towards knowledge, because Christians were extremely curious in that sense. I was telling you before, that is the concept that if God had created the world, it is for mankind to investigate it as a bigger picture of as a symbol of God's perfection. So there was a certain intellectual push for going beyond what was the immediate evidence, but it was sensed, however, that the Frederick was trying to question the very essence of the universe, which is something that in Christian terms is not really the best you can do, because essentially that means rising above even what God has decided. So I keep going back on Dante's comedy, because even in here you find in hell together, not really in the same place of Frederick, but it's still in hell, the fate of Ulysses. Ulysses goes to hell not because he's a pagan, or because otherwise he could have, theoretically, at this time Christ's word wasn't there, so he could have been excused. No, he goes to hell. And why does he go to hell? Because Ulysses had crossed the boundaries of the world as he had conceived by God, that were essentially the Strait of Gibraltar. So the idea, even in Dante's time, which is remarkable, is that from the Strait of Gibraltar you could reach the Garden of Eden, that was thought in medieval perspective to be the Sri Lanka, the island of Ceylon. So it was already believed in Dante's times that if you fared west from Spain, from Africa, you could basically reach the Indias and Ceylon. And before getting to Ceylon, because he basically arrives inside of the island with all his fellow sailors that had rowed constantly with under him on during the Odyssey. Ulysses gets basically swallowed by a giant vortex whirlpool that obviously kills him together with all the crew, and was supposed to mean the inaccessibility of the paradise on earth by humans, because God had forbidden that. So Frederick, in this sense, was seen as something similar. A man so powerful in politics and military, in all the elements that were making him the greater sovereign at that time, that he had become too bold, too powerful even for being the head of Christianity. So this was usually what the Guelphs described Frederick as a sort of non-believer who had very strange tendencies even towards Islam. There was this belief that the Frederick liked Muslims more than Christians. Why was the case? Well, it wasn't just a matter, it was an old prejudice, telling the truth, also in Norman times, because we kind of got mostly the heroic picture of the Normans as the great conquerors of the Mediterranean, but from a continental perspective, especially from a French or German one, the Normans of southern Italy were kind of bastards, poulains in French. I mean, they by having wanted to create a kingdom into a Muslim land like Sicily, they had kind of got contaminated by Islamic culture, and they weren't felt as the pure Christian knights that sometimes they're epitomized as in modern culture. So there were a lot of prejudices already towards the kingdom of Sicily as such. Plus, what Frederick did, telling the truth, to get rid initially of the Islamic presence in Sicily, was to gather all the Muslims still inhabiting in Sicily after the Norman conquest, and placing them in a city in northern Apulia, so on the Italian mainland in south, that is called Lucera. It was an old Roman city that was still important in the Middle Ages. It was a depopulated area, and basically the Muslims had their own city there. Now, the history of Muslim Lucera is quite interesting, because these Muslims were, eventually survived as a community after Frederick. Then they were used by the Angevins and eventually slaughtered by the Angevins. But Frederick had created them, first of all, to get rid of the Sicilian countryside by the Muslim brigandage, essentially. Lucera, at that point, was conceived as a true city, as a true Muslim city in Christian lands. Now, from a papal perspective, this was unconceivable. Frederick, telling the truth, had done that because he could control those Muslims, because giving Lucera certain city rights, these guys would be loyal to Frederick rather than being brigands like they had been in Sicily. And especially they made up part of his personal guard. The armies of Frederick that fought into central northern Italy were made up in part by the Muslims of Lucera. And these were kind of light troops, light infantry, like cavalry, that used to harass the enemy with arrows, mostly, and javelins. So these typical Muslim, these typical tactics of the Muslim, I can't say militias, but that they weren't so extremely widespread in feudal Europe. since the ancient world as part of the local military traditions, and that seemingly had a kind of interesting impact also on the military of that time. These guys seemingly were being skilled also in military engineering. So, and the presence of these Muslims in his retinue would be conceived as a sort of, of proof that he was not a Christian, that he preferred Islam to Christianity. And plus all the wealth that came obviously from being an extremely powerful sovereign that had summed up the German Sicilian lands and even the one in the Near East, Jerusalem, etc. I mean, Frederick liked to ostentate all his power, also because it was part of his imperial politics. He had to show that the empire had to be rich, wealthy, and also exteriorly, while the papacy had to be resized because it was too wealthy from his perspective, and he wanted to make it stick to the evangelical, even the evangelical material poverty that was preached in the scriptures. So there was a reaction to Frederick as a character in most in great part at least of the European world, because of the clashes between the Guelphs and Ghibellines, and there was all a prophetic tradition that was mostly revolving around the works of the Italian religious man and Joachim of Fiore, who was incidentally also a border limit heretic in many ways, but he had a huge fortune in his time, and what Joachim had seen in these prophetic visions, etc., is that Frederick would have been the terrible and mythical figure that would precede the end of times. So, nothing less than the Antichrist himself. So, at a point in this, today we talked mostly about intellectual matters, but you have to think that Frederick waged terrible wars everywhere, and where a lot of people dying, being massacred, huge battles and stuff like that. So there would be also a lot of hatred, of political and factional hatred towards him, that would produce certain ideological beliefs. And it's very famous. I quoted it another time, that people at the time really believed in such a prophecy. There is an Italian author of northern Italy that had been the battlefield of most of Frederick's campaigns against the Lombard League allied with the Pope. That is Salimbene from Parma. And this guy, he was a religious man, he was a monk, and he survived. He lived up to the end of the 13th century, so he in his youth he had lived in during the time of Frederick, and in his old age he was writing, and he was recalling when Frederick died in 1250, and in spite of what Joachim of Flore had told, the world was still going on, because basically it was believed that when the Antichrist, that Frederick would have died, so the Antichrist would have died, the world would have come to an end, because Jesus would have come back on earth, there would be the final judgment and so on. Instead, Frederick died and nothing happened. So this is an interesting anecdote to understand medieval mind, because Salimbene comments in this aspect. I truly believed that Frederick was the Antichrist, and yet I was wrong. And Salimbene was ferociously adverse to Frederick for political reasons, and yet he had the intellectual honesty and humility to say, I was wrong. We all believed that Frederick was the Antichrist. We truly believed that. We were sure about it, and yet it is not true. And this is, I think, an extraordinary piece of medieval mind, because you see, first of all, the interconnection between the religious and political sphere that definitely had been quite an issue for centuries at that point. But especially you see the genuine convictions that people had. I mean, the same intellectual curiosity and the same intellectual work that you can find in Frederick, you couldn't find it even in these authors who really believed that the world could be understandable, and that there would be certain prophecies, certain forms of knowledge that really made sense, because it was God who was essentially letting them to be known, and it was very difficult for someone like that, for someone who believes that thing has been said by God, to say I was wrong, because obviously God is not wrong, but you as a human, so you also kind of failed in front of God, because you believed something different in His name, essentially, and it was your intellectual fault to have been wrong. And this is why spiritual things are so important. Spiritual matters and the spiritual dimension is so fundamental to understand the medieval world, because contrarily wise to what many people think, it's not just about self-interest. It's mostly about self-interest in history, but it's also about beliefs that can be reasonable, unreasonable, doesn't matter, but there's still influence through ideas and consequent effects on daily life, even at the social excellence of an emperor. But there was not just bad press for Frederick. We must say that there was a sort of Ghibelline public opinion that, let me tell you, was probably much more rational and politically and secularly oriented than the Guelph one, that instead felt more the papal perspective from a spiritual point of view, and instead believed Frederick to have been like some of the greatest Roman emperors of the past, like the Restitutor or Reparator Orbis. That means, the one who put the world back in order. And it's interesting to believe also in here, in the medieval perspective, that Frederick was a Roman emperor, like there had been an Augustus or a Trajan or a Constantine. There would be a Frederick, and for saying that, even the idea of the empire was something extremely, today we say, oh well, but the Holy Roman Empire was kind of an invention because it wasn't really the old Roman Empire. Yeah, today we know that how things went, but these people really and truly believed, and telling the truth, not really with such such a high degree of ideological falsity, that what was being rebuilt there was the Roman Empire, also because nobody could gain so much power if this power had not been conferred by God some way. Frederick, after all, had been crowned by the Pope as Roman Emperor, so he was the real one, and the Ghibellines, as I was saying, were extremely much more concerned about the actual secular politics and especially the need of giving back to the quite politically fragmented Western Christendom a head, and Frederick had to be that one. And this was seen in turn also in highly spiritual matters, because obviously recreating the empire wasn't just a secular thing, but it was also something wanted by God, to make all the Christians dwell peacefully in this pacified world where all everything went right, at least according to the models. And also, by the way, because the Ghibellines mostly supported, maybe not extremely much in the 13th century, but definitely there still was the idea that the church had to be reformed at that point. So the purity of the church was entrusted in part to the decisions of the Roman emperor, and that was one of the duties that obviously looked back of the first Christian emperor Constantine, and the protection that he gave to the first ecumenical council, and because it was meant to work, that emperor and papacy had to work like one at that point. And was even and there are really lots of legends about Frederick that are framed into this picture, and that sometimes have more to do with the ideals of chivalric ideas that we were talking about at the beginning of the video, because there was a legend that according to which Frederick actually never died. But he would have to come back mysteriously at the end of times, and to guide the Christians against the forces of evil. So you can imagine the might of this figure, and the great glory that certain someone at that time attributed to him. And this is interesting because this is a very there are so many legends like this in Western history. Probably the most famous, the one of King Arthur, that has to come back to save England when things will get rough. And it's interesting that in the Swabian dynasty, in the Hohenstaufen family, there would be the same thing. Actually, even for Frederick's grandfather, Frederick the First, Barbarossa, who, according to legend, he's not really dead, but he lies. He's asleep in a mountain back in the heart of Germany, and he will come back when the Reich will be in trouble. So that they all copy each other, and there are so many legends about Frederick. Honestly, there is when Frederick died, then there was a multiplication of visions everywhere. According to, there was a Sicilian legend, I think, that said that when Frederick died, in the shores of, I don't remember where, in northeastern Sicily, close to I think in the Etna Vulcan. I don't remember whether if Frederick was seen riding with all his knights into the Vulcan or into the sea. I don't remember, but you have to think about the visual dimension after all of the medieval world. This idea that the world is also made of visions that are obviously always made possible by God for people to understand the mind of a certain world. I think about all these collective suggestions that you can still find in many areas of the world, especially the least educated can compare in some ways with the medieval societies, and how important these visions actually are for their life, in spite of being mass suggestions. I don't know, maybe you can believe about it. I personally find it difficult, and I'm more of a rationalist, but it's still meaningful, quite meaningful anthropologically, and that tells you, especially about Frederick, how certain figures really mark an era in many ways. As some of you already know, I love the Hohenstaufen. Please go check the videos I made about them, just to increase a bit the views. But I mean, you can't really stop talking about the Hohenstaufen and about Frederick II, but Frederick I, the fate of the dynasty sealed at the Battle of Tagliacozzo and the beheading of Conrad. I mean, these are sort of things that if you love the Middle Ages, you can't avoid to feel, really. In part, maybe in a tiny part, in the measure that those people could feel them. I have this presumptuous opinion. So, an advice I can give you, and then I will conclude, is never to fully rationalize history. You know, when you read a source, never think about it in let's tear it down in the rational way. You know, let's filter what is, you know, suggestion and what is factual reality. Well, you can't really do that, especially in societies like the medieval one. When you read a source, you have always to frame it into the bigger picture of medieval spiritual sensibility in many ways, and especially at this time, you know, Frederick was still, and it would be again considered as the last great universal leader, you know, the one who, with the death of whom basically medieval universalism died, and you can witness instead the rise of proto-national or national monarchies that basically were the base of the modern states, and this kind of secular idea where there is no universal emperor but essentially a bunch of free states. So I think it's very meaningful. So this was a long video about Frederick II, and I hope you enjoyed it, because I like very much talking about it with you, and I hope you found it interesting for what I can make such topics interesting. I'm really no expert about the subject matter, and but I love to discuss about it, and I hope that more people get familiar with such topics, because they're really the heart, the cream of the Middle Ages in many ways. So I thank you very much for listening. If you like this video, please like it or share it. Otherwise, subscribe to my channel if you feel like you wanna receive more. Receive news about my contents, and for the rest, as always, I thank you heartily for listening. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.